be here. Lovely to be in New Zealand. When I flew over here, I immediately de-stressed and I just felt so relaxed and at home. And yes, I'm a psychologist, and I know a lot of you must have a lot of opinions about psychologists. You know the joke they always tell, what are 1,000 psychologists at the bottom of the sea? A good start. But not everybody is as you think psychologists may be, and some do try to integrate the Christian anthropology with psychology. I've worked in this area for about 30 years, mainly with adolescents, children, and with young adults in the pro-life area. I'm constantly struck by the fact that we've got such psychological terminology in our language. We talk about group dynamics, stroking the ego, anger management. Children are even willing to give diagnoses, even to me. And you know, one came in and she diagnosed herself, and she said, "I've got ADHD." She said very smartly, and she said, "I caught it from my mother." And then she said, "But my mother says I caught it from my father." And then another girl came in and said, Miss, I got some really good news. My mother had a baby." I said, "That's great, congratulations." She said, "No." She said, "She's got post-mortem depression." It's interesting that children are into this diagnosis language, and you know, that they're into sort of knowing the statistical and the terminology from the Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders. There have been many new disorders introduced to that manual because there's been an increased knowledge of biochemistry and an increased knowledge of human behaviour, some insights into the motivation of human behaviour. And every few years the committees revise the DSM, and they revise the diagnoses and put in new ones. For example, a new one now is internet gaming disorder. Another one is hoarding disorder. These were never in the manuals before. However, and it's a big however, in recent years there have been additions made to the Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders without any scientific basis whatsoever. For example, everybody knew for a long time, and everybody accepted it in a more Christian society, that homosexuality was a disorder. It was removed from the diagnostic manual in 1973 because of political lobbying. In 2015, gender identity disorder was removed. And everybody from Freud onwards knew that having a gender identity disorder was a problem. The groups that tried to influence the committees of psychiatrists and psychologists were very politically motivated by critical theory, gay rights and gender theory. And I will explain what critical theory is later on in my talk. This was all because people wanted to help the other. You know, we live in a society that's so psychologised. There have been world wars. People are really traumatised. People are trying to work out why such wars happened, where we ended up killing so many millions of our own people. They want to seek the answer to violence. We see it constantly on television and throughout the world. And we kind of say, well, what's the reason for all of this? Why? Why is this happening? I think a lot of people think that to help the other, the one who's different, is a good thing. And it is a good thing. We've got the parable of the Good Samaritan. The one who was not a Jew, the Samaritan, was helped, or the person who was bashed on the way to Jericho was helped by another, not his own group. He was helped by a Samaritan. So we've got that very deeply embedded in our psyche, that story of being helped by another. However, the other now has been taken to include anybody with any deviant behaviour, any kind of unusual focus, and so the other is now a term used in a very sympathetic way by people who are sort of Marxist revolutionaries and so on, who want to transform society. So if you're not sympathetic to gay marriage, then you're not sympathetic to the other. you see, and it's almost you're going against your own Christian morality. So you've got to make a distinction. Yes, it's good to help the other, but not to normalise every deviant behaviour or every disordered behaviour. Now, Dr. Quentin Meter is an American paediatric endocrinologist. He stated that the transgender movement is not based on a shred of scientific evidence. While emphasising the need to extend compassion and respect for those confused and struggling with their sexual identity, Dr. Meter, who's treated many children and adults in this area, said that it's a social movement dressed up as science. It asserts rather than demonstrates or reasons. In fact, it is a flight from reason. It is fake science. It's fake psychology. We have a continual stream of stories now. California, high school student believed he's a girl trapped in a boy's body and he just made it to the girls' softball team. He can play with that team, that girls' team, because of the change in state law. In Australia, the government broadcasting station, the ABC, featured Lieutenant Colonel McGregor, an army officer, cricket expert, speechwriter, known to many in political life as a man, but now it's Lieutenant Catherine McGregor, and she is now one of Australia's highest profile transgender people. The US Episcopalian Convention has approved new anti-discrimination language for transgender church members, and some of them have allowed transgender ministers. Victoria in Australia has a Gender and Sexuality Commissioner and said that LGBTQIA, got to get it right, Victorians experience discrimination in every aspect, in schools, in the workplaces, health settings, in the broader community. So now there is a guide to assist public servants to use the term Z for he and she, so nobody feels discriminated against. So this is in a government public service publication. And so the Inclusive Language Guide also warns people not to use offensive questions. So if you turn up one day, you're a man and you turn up as a woman, somebody says, "Oh, what happened? That's offensive." So you've just got to accept whatever transformations you think up overnight. In Canada, they're probably the most advanced, if I can put that in inverted commas, in the sense, in the gender-neutral revolution, in that its new proposed Civil Rights Act says that you can be sued, you can be convicted if you offend a transgender. And the offence is not that you intend to offend them, it's in the eye of a transgendered person. So if you happen to say hello the wrong way, or if you greeted an intersex person and they were queer gender, you're in the wrong and you can be offended. And that's why some of you may have heard of Jordan Peterson. That's why Jordan Peterson, the psychologist, went on Canadian TV saying, "This is coercion in language and I will not participate in it." And he actually stood up to this postmodern kind of attempt to control our language. A Catholic moral theology professor, Christian Brugger, stated that now there's a baffling multiplication of categories of sexuality. He said that transgenderism is a catch-all term for anyone that you want to be. A Christian psychologist called Mark Yarhouse said that it's almost as if psychology dictates ontology, like you can become whatever being you want to be. Also, the American Psychological Association has accepted that you can change transgender. So that's a very powerful so-called expert authority stating that you can change gender and the society accepts it, and you're going the wrong way if you dare to challenge it. One day I'm going to write a book about how I flew under the radar in a government school for so many years. I actually did it as a quiet subversive. I know my secret is safe with you. But it's not easy when everybody's going one way and you But with students, you know, you can appeal to the common sense of the student, and that's what's really been so good. Well, one student came in and said, "I think I'm gay." And I said, "Tell me about yourself." And I said at the end of the interview, "I think you've got a lot of problems, you suffered a lot, your family is really... Let's talk about your family." That boy wasn't gay. I could have easily given him a number to say, "Ring up the gay lesbian hotline." And that's what is done. I didn't. That boy now is a grown man, married, with a child. And I say how dangerous it is unless you explore the problems underneath this, you know, sort of these speculations that children have about themselves. So what it presents itself as a human rights issue, that is to be whoever you want to be, is really at base a philosophical, metaphysical and a political issue. But it's disguised as a human rights issue in a new version of Orwellian political correctness, way beyond anything Orwell could have thought of. Now, where did this all come from? Did it just spring out of the blue in the last 2 years? No. The first calls for transgenderism came at the end of the 19th century. Magnus Hirschfeld observed and categorised 64 different types of sexual identities, and he advocated for, rights. Now, I get to the point where I don't want to say anything negative about New Zealand because I love New Zealand, but there was a fellow from New Zealand who set up the first gender identity clinic. His name was John Money. And early in the mid-century, John Money, who was born in New Zealand, became Professor of Paediatrics and Medical Psychology at Johns Hopkins University. Dr. Money was a dedicated Kinsey disciple, and he was on the board of the Kinsey Institute, which did experiments on children, which would now be designated as child abuse. Money co-founded the Johns Hopkins Gender Identity Clinic in 1966, and it was run by 10 specialists. And one of their first projects was the Canadian boy, David Reimer. He was one of twin boys born in Manitoba in 1966. Reimer was born a healthy male, but due to damaged sex organs as a result of a badly done circumcision, he ended up being referred to Dr. Money. And then his problems started. Dr. Money decided to turn him into a female, into a woman. He gave him the name Brenda, co-opted the parents in this, dressed him in dresses, and from the age of 11 onwards, Reimer began just to keep dressing. But then he got to the age of 13 and 14, puberty, and he started to question it. And he started to oppose Dr. Money. And this poor little boy, with all the pressure of this doctor and his parents, challenged it and said, "No, I'm a boy." How much courage it took that child to say that. And he left because he said he found these sessions with Dr. Money very traumatic. He was so traumatised he developed depression. He happened to have a twin brother who was male. That twin brother was traumatised by what had happened to his own brother and committed suicide in 2002. And poor David Reimer, the little boy who was experimented on, committed suicide in 2004 because of the damage that had been done psychologically. Now, the failure of this project wasn't much advertised in the news at all. And Dr. John Money refused to accept any responsibility for that. He just said it's due to right-wing bias, anti-feminism, redneck, the usual kind of stuff that's thrown at people who try to have a reasoned discussion about these things. However, the sex reassignment project closed. Interesting. Because even before 1979, uncertainty about gender change was resurfacing. At Johns Hopkins, people were talking about the stresses. Dr. Paul McHugh, one of the original doctors working there, he said he noticed that many people afterwards became suicidal. And he said, and one doctor said, "My personal feeling is that surgery is not the appropriate treatment for a psychiatric disorder. And it's clear to me that these patients have severe psychological problems that don't go away following surgery." So it was closed. But what happened? You see, after it closed, you still had, in the 1970s, this incredible rise of cultural Marxism, of revolution, of wanting to deconstruct Western society. Where did that come from? We know that it existed. I mean, the Marxists and deconstructionists had their origins in the Frankfurt Institute. And the Frankfurt Institute was an institution set up in 1923. Now, I know this sounds very strange, but this is one of the most significant influences on it, truly. The Frankfurt Institute was started in 1923. It was established by Lenin and Western Marxists. It was funded mainly by Lenin and a Western Marxist who called himself a Salon Bolshevik. Felix Weil was his name. And they said, because we can't take over the West in military terms, we have to destroy the society. And that means the family, the culture, the education system, everything that makes for what they call the superculture. Because if we can't destroy it militarily and through its economic system, we will destroy it through its culture. And they set about doing it. There were people like Herbert Marcuse, a very important figure in all of this, Theodor Adorno, Erich Fromm. And in the 1930s and 40s, they went to America to escape the rise of Hitler. And they got jobs in universities, especially Columbia University. And when Herbert Marcuse got a job at Columbia University, he ended up having a big influence on the pedagogical, the teacher formation. So by the 1950s and 60s, 70% of teacher formation was being influenced by this Marxist-inspired Frankfurt Institute. Not many people know about it because their manner was to go quietly, but there is a rising interest in the harm that has been done in this way. And of course, their first principle was never call it communist, just call it Marxist. Let people get angry about communists, but we'll just stay there quietly in the background as quiet Marxists and we'll transform the society. So how did they do it? The idea they put in people's heads was institutions are at fault. You are being oppressed by institutions. And you see, that idea was there in the 60s. That was behind the protests, the Paris barricades, the protests in America. And that was the idea at the basis of critical theory. Destroy the society because you deserve better. Don't be oppressed by this leader or that leader, or don't be oppressed by political, religious or other beliefs. You know, tear them down and build something yourself. And that hit the gender change program. So people started to say, oh, even though that program closed down at Johns Hopkins Uni, we can still change society. We can be whoever we want to be. Especially the feminists echoed this. So Kate Bornstein said, patriarchy is the enemy. We've got to do away with fatherhood, with this traditional notion of the male. And she said, doing away with gender is key to doing away with patriarchy. Gender fluidity is the ability to freely and knowingly become one of a limitless number of genders for any length of time, because gender fluidity recognises no borders or rules of gender. So that's already there in the 60s, and it grows in the 70s. By the 1980s, you had most humanities departments in universities in Western society filled with these ideas of tearing down institutions, patriarchy, and hence gender identity ideas. So what happens? Roll on 2015, and after all these decades of pushing for this liberation, the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders changes, and it says now Gender identity problems are not a disorder, they're a dysphoria. Now, dysphoria is just a fancy word for saying you've got a headache or you feel a bit off. So it's like saying, oh, well, it's just a feeling you're a bit off because you realise that you want to be another gender. Trouble is, when it was a disorder, you could get it paid for by Medicare. Now that it's not a disorder, they got upset. They said, oh, no, we can't get it for free now because, you know, Medicare won't pay for it. So that was a bit of a downside to it. Apparently in prison, if you want to change your gender, the prison authorities will pay for it. So some of them were saying, you're lucky if you're in prison, you can change your gender. We're so oppressed, we can't get it for free outside. Anyway, so what's happened is that the idea is that gender is a social construct. You see, in Marxism, that was a classic belief, that you are not born with a nature. There's no such thing as human nature, there's no such thing as being. Did away with all Western philosophy and all the notions of it. You are simply born as a blank slate and the society will form you. That was the idea behind communism, and it's now the idea behind this sinister form of godless life, which is called cultural Marxism. It's not a lighter form of communism. In a sense, it's more sinister. I mean, if you're in a profession like mine, you try to go to a staff meeting and tell people what you really think about gender identity and homosexuality. If they're from the secular world, I work on a one-by-one basis. I pick the people I know that I can convince, and in that way I've been able to find quite a network of support among people. But you can't say it in public, and the psychologists themselves say that. You can't say that in public. Teachers in schools say you can't say that in public. You've got to accept all the gay agenda and the transgender agenda. See how this sinister influence works on the major institutions of our society. But did anybody fight back? Yes. Please, you know, trumpets and orchestra, start playing now. Yeah, it's not surprising that a country previously crushed under the ideological yoke of Nazism and communism smelt an ideological rat. In 2014, Polish parish priests in Poland were instructed to read an apostolic letter entitled "The Dangers Stemming from Gender Ideology." And it was a letter that was very firm and clear about the social, political and ideological context of the gender agenda. The episcopal letter said, the gender ideology movement is the product of many decades of ideological and cultural changes that are deeply rooted in Marxism and neo-Marxism. They're endorsed by some feminist movements and the sexual revolution. The ideology promotes principles that are totally contrary to reality and an integral understanding of human nature. It maintains that biological sex is not socially significant and that humans can develop and determine any sex irrespective of biological conditions. So it's a form of self-determination in a Western context. And what they found really sinister was that this was being pushed onto Poland from Western Europe without the consent of the Poles. Not lacking in dramatic language, the last two popes have spoken on gender ideology. Pope Francis says it's a demonic attempt to reorder society. And it's a dispute on the very nature of the person. The more philosophically inclined, Pope Emeritus Benedict XVI said in his 2012 Christmas address that making the gender of the person are at the foundation of this revolution, saying sex, these are his words, sex is no longer a given element of nature that man has to accept and personally make sense of. It is a social role that we choose for ourselves. The profound falsehood of this theory and of the anthropological revolution contained within it is obvious. People dispute the idea that they have a nature given by their bodily identity that serves as the defining element of the human being. So the popes were onto it already within the last decade and very strongly. Did others fight back? Yes. Philosophers have struck back. John Scalco has written a very interesting article on the problems which the popes have pointed to. He said, what differentiates human males from human females? Is it the number of sex chromosomes? Is it the possession of appropriate sex organs? Is it the amount of testosterone or estrogen? He said the difficulty with this is none of these standards always works because individuals are born with a bit extra here and there, but individuals, some females have higher testosterone levels, for example, than some men. Some men have higher estrogen levels. He said no. He said it's that there is an ordering to reproduction that's built into our very nature, that if there were no sexual reproduction possible between male and female, there would be no concept of gender. There'd be no biological sex in human beings. Defects occur in nature, but defects imply a norm. So, for example, a castrated man is still a man, right? A female who's had a mastectomy after cancer is still a woman. Just because the organs aren't there doesn't change you. The fact that one was born with ambiguous genitalia doesn't do away with one's true sex that one is really born with. He adds, there has never been born a person with two pairs of sexual organs that are fully functioning. I mean, there are some cases like there's androgyny syndrome, where somebody may be born with some female organs and male organs. And the doctors check and see what is this person, male or female, and then they'll operate to clear that up. That happens very rarely, but it can happen. But nobody's ever been born with two sets of organs that function perfectly. Otherwise, you could self-fertilise yourself and then have a baby yourself, and then no marriage would be necessary. And that's ridiculous. It doesn't happen. So Skowronska concludes that it's the capacity for reproduction built into our nature that grounds the distinction between male and female. Professor Nicholas Tonti-Filippini of the Catholic John Paul II Institute, who died a few years ago, he drew the distinction between, first, congenital disorder of sex development, and second, of gender dysphoria identity problems. So in the first, you have organic problems. In the second, you've got psychological problems. Right? In the first one, if you're born with the wrong developed sexual organs, the doctors can operate on that, but you have no doubt whether you're a man or a woman. But some people are born with perfect female organs and they say, but I want to be a man. And that's the psychological problem. Now, the Catechism of the Catholic Church states that except when performed for strictly therapeutic reasons, direct intended amputations, mutilations and sterilisations performed on innocent persons are against the moral law. Gender reassignment often involves multiple mutilations of healthy organs and invasive hormonal treatment such as puberty blockers. So, as Dominican theologian Benedict Ashley says, the good of a person cannot be achieved at the expense of a destruction of a basic human function, except to save a human life. David Schindler, who's a great philosopher, a theologian, says, and this is for the Thomistic scholars among you, gender isn't an accident. It's not a way of appearing or behaving. He says gender difference is coextensive with the form that defines the substance. In other words, it's a difference that goes all the way down, not determining some particular essential content of the nature, but rather determining the manner of the content, a difference in modality of the form. Okay, that's for the philosophers among you, but we know people are born male and female. Psychologists and psychiatrists have fought back. You may not know their names, but they are there. If anybody wants a copy of these, I've done a summary in PowerPoint form, which I haven't gone through this talk. You just let me know and I can send them to you, because it'll give you a summary of what I've said, and you'll have the names of the psychologists and psychiatrists who fought back. One of them is Dr. Fitzgibbon, American psychiatrist. He said it's a category mistake to think you can be a different gender. And he said it's one that endangers people's lives. He goes on to say that the largest study to date of the long-term psychological state of post-sex reassignment surgery was an analysis of over 300 people who had undergone it in Sweden. This 2011 study demonstrated that persons after sex reassignment have considerably higher risks for mortality, suicidal behaviour and psychiatric morbidity than the general population. The former leader of the Gender Reassignment Institute at Johns Hopkins University, Dr. Paul McHugh, said that actually the rate of suicide he found rose almost 20-fold when compared with the same non-transgender population. He was alarmed and he said we should be ringing alarm bells and not buying into this. Dr. Michelle Cretella, who's currently president of the American College of Paediatricians, warned that the treatment proposed for transgenders was really a form of abuse. She said just a few years ago, not many could have imagined a high-profile showdown over transgender men and women's access to single-sex bathrooms in North Carolina. But transgender ideology is not just infecting our laws, it's intruding into the lives of the most innocent among us, children, with the apparent growing support of the professional medical community. Cretella noted that the new DSM definition, which now endangers children, is continuing and growing. At one stage there were only 24 gender clinics in 2014. Now there are hundreds and they're training doctors, paediatricians and so on. In Australia, where I come from, there were 2 such clinics in 2012. Now there are 76, and there are many children coming and asking for sex reassignment, primary-aged children. See, if a child merely expresses the slightest thought of being different, the brochures which advise people tell parents, go along with your children. If they express a wish to be another gender, go along with it, and age 11 or 12 they can go onto puberty blockers. Just say to them they're gender dysphoric, and if they still feel trapped in the wrong body at age 16, then they're placed on cross-sex hormones and surgery starts. Can you imagine the damage this does to people if they wake up afterwards and say, oh, I did the wrong thing, what do I do now? People who think they're born in the wrong body, she said that idea is false. She said, if it were true, identical twins who have exactly the same genetic construction would have 100% concordance, but it doesn't happen. If you look at identical twins, some of them want to be transgender, but the other twin doesn't want to be. So it's not something that they can say that is unavoidable. And in fact, there's a big debate about the genetic side of, say, being gay and the genetic component in being transgender. In fact, there is no such thing. They're psychological problems. But I heard in England a group of gays said, you're born gay, you can't help it. The transgender said, no, you can have this thing in your head and you just want to be another gender. And the gays started arguing with them, and there was a big punch-up, and all these transgenders got black eyes and the gays got black eyes because they were arguing about the genetic origins and so on. It was in England. I remember hearing it on the radio, and I thought, now I've heard everything. You know, but at least they were thinking about the genetic origins of their state. There's an American professor, Paul McHugh, and we've got in Australia Professor Whitehall. They're really fighting this transgender agenda through the media, through the mainstream media as much as they can. But what about those who do suffer gender identity problems? I've talked about some of the philosophical and metaphysical problems and about some of the psychologists and psychiatrists who fight back. What about young people who do feel that way? You may or may not have heard of a man called Walt Heyer, H-E-Y-E-R. Walt Heyer was minded by his grandmother as a boy, who, strange to say, it's a different sort of abuse story, she did abuse him. She used to dress him in women's clothes, and she actually physically abused him. He also had an uncle who physically abused him. He was so desperately unhappy growing up that he thought if he changed genders, he could solve the problem. And this is what so often happens. He hated himself. He was so sad, so depressed, so miserable. But he didn't do it straight away. He actually, as a young man, he did get married and he had a few children, and then he decided to change gender, causing immense worry to his wife and to the children. He then went and sought help. This all comes from his book entitled Paper Genders. He then went to seek help, and sad to say, the first priest that he went to seek help, he did go to a Catholic priest, actually suggested some homosexual kind of activity to him, so he ran screaming from there. He then went to a minister who actually did try to help him, though he didn't have a lot of kind of book knowledge or professional knowledge to help him, and he decided then he'd go it himself. He started to look at himself and his background and his childhood, and then he said, maybe it's because I was really unhappy at the people who minded me when I was a child. And so what happened was he managed to think himself out of this state with great courage, and he said, no, I really was born a man. And so he had reverse surgery. And he wrote a book about it called Paper Genders. And if you ever want to give a book to somebody who is considering this transgender agenda, I don't mean somebody who is transgender, I mean somebody who's thinking about it, who's maybe studying psychology or who's studying nursing or medicine. Give this book to them. Please, it's a very good testimony of how much a person suffered. And this is one of the things that Walt Heyer said. Gender surgeons today testify that gender change has a very high rate of success, but they fail to include the suicides, the regret, the medical problems, and those who return to their birth gender. Researchers and doctors will hide facts, twist the results, and hide failures from their peers and the public in order to protect their practice and prestige. Meanwhile, the lives of their patients are irreparably damaged. You know, years ago there was a great interest in lobotomies, and a few psychiatrists got into that. When patients had complex mental issues, often they were very simplistically referred for an lobotomy. There was a Dr. Walter Freeman who performed so many lobotomies he was nicknamed the ice pick doctor. Complaints and investigations eventually caused that medical practice to stop. However, there was no opposition from the actual victims of lobotomies, as they were in no position to speak or defend themselves. However, with the sex change operations, which are being inflicted on some people with a psychological disorder, we have people who are insisting that the treatment is harmful to them, like Dr. Cretella, Dr. Paul McHugh, Dr. Fitzgibbon, Professor Whitehall in Australia, among many others. And you've got the ex-transgenders speaking about it. So that gives us a voice. If people say, oh, but you're a redneck right-wing Catholic and what do you know about it? You say, oh, but look, I was just reading this by a person who was transgender. Maybe you'd be interested in that. And Walt Heyer goes around to a lot of the courts and he's trying to go against these legal changes that are being imposed on people. He said the truly intolerant are the transgender activists themselves who do not want to acknowledge the truth. To claim gender change success, you have to exclude all the sufferings. The activists have infiltrated the scientific community so that research studies aren't framed in a way to acknowledge or study the downsides of gender change treatment. The patients themselves are intimidated into silence if they ever realise the treatment didn't work for them. Females return to their male gender after having gender surgery and receiving female birth records. They stay silent because of their shame and fear, the fear of bullying from activists. They're not counted because they do not count with the activists. Like lobotomy patients of the past, it appears that gender change patients are considered throwaway lives by the promoters of the procedure. And the reality is our lives have been revealed by the Creator who spoke through the Gospels, male and female, he created them. But perhaps one of the great witnesses to all this is a young boy called Patrick Mitchell. Patrick Mitchell is an Aussie, and a couple of years ago he decided he wanted to change gender and be a girl. And his mother said, okay, because that's what she thought would help him. Of course, dear. And he was diagnosed by an expert as having gender dysphoria, and he took heavy doses of estrogen for a year. And then he said, one day he woke up and he just said, I don't need to change genders. I can be happy being who I am. Now that story got onto 60 Minutes, one of the current affairs programs in Australia, and it made such a sensation because nobody had ever heard it. It was very fashionable at first because he wanted to change genders. That was part one, and they had to put in part two because that was the end of the story. So the journalists were very confused, and everybody was very confused that he'd returned to his original gender. But, you know, we should listen to Patrick out of the mouths of babes. For parents whose children suddenly announce that they're transgender or gay, it is a great suffering. It's very important to resist the urge to outbursts and accusations. The tone should be one rather of sadness and lamentation than anger. But keep talking. Say, son, daughter, why have you done this to us? You know what it's going to do to us. So get the attention away from talking about the homosexual and transgender problem to this is going to affect other people. Because often the person is so locked in their own way of thinking, they don't think of the effect on others. William Kilpatrick, another American psychologist, states that delusional thinking has become a main feature of the modern mind, and that we're living through a rebellion against reality. The transgender issue falls within the postmodern philosophical retreat from the knowability of truth, and hence denial of respect for any revelation. It denies any given nature in a person. It says a person can be anyone, anything, anyone he or she wants to be. The origins are moral relativist, Marxist, and the moral relativism now is that anybody can have his or her own truth. It's tragic that not only are youth entangled in it, but there have also been professionals drawn along to it who should know better. But thankfully, in this case, there are professionals, psychologists and paediatricians, who do know better, and they should be more coherently organised into a group, and they continue to dissent from the prevailing view, and they continue to speak the truth with love. And I would say that that is the challenge for us, as Cardinal Burke says, to speak in loving truth to these people, and to do the best we can to help them, and to use the evidence of Walt Heyer and Patrick Mitchell to them. Thank you, God bless you, and if you have any questions, I'd be happy to answer them.